Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast, A Journey Through Nature and Science. I'm your host, Don Murphy. This episode is all about genealogy. Our guest today is Mica Anders. Mica Anders is the history detective you never knew you needed. With over 20 years in genealogy, she's made it her mission to uncover the stories history forgot. Specializing in African American and Midwestern U.S. narratives, Mica turns dusty records and forgotten facts into captivating tales. As a member of the Association of Professional Genealogists and recipient of the 2023 Minnesota Genealogical Society Pioneer Award, Mica brings forgotten histories to life. Whether you're curious about your family's journey or want to add depth to your organization's story, Mike is here to help you discover the amazing hidden chapters of your past. That is, how does uncovering one's family history impact their sense of identity and place in the world? Mica, welcome to the program. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much.
So, Mica, tell us a little bit about what got you started on this journey. Was there an epiphany somewhere back in your youth that said, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life?
So for me, it actually took a pretty roundabout path. I started out working in the art field. So I have a master's of fine arts degree. And in that work, a lot of the art projects I was making were about family and they were about identity. And I already had a sort of a side hobby passion for genealogy. And I started making art projects based on people's genealogy. I would get friends and associates, and I would do their genealogy back about 3-4 generations and turn those into art pieces. And that feeling of reintroducing people to their ancestors, giving them back stories on their family they never even knew, it was amazing. I never knew I would enjoy doing other people's family history as much, if not more, than my own.
Right. No, I understand. Well, that's pretty cool. So it started out, if I understand, as a hobby for you,
Mhm.
and a hobby that you just fell in love with and that you've now changed into a vocation for yourself and
Absolutely.
to help other people as well. So I want to kind of start off at the very beginning. I mentioned DNA already, so I think people are really interested in knowing, how do you go about doing genealogy, and what is the use of DNA studies and using almost forensics type techniques have to do with finding out your genealogical history?
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you compared it to forensics. It very much feels like detective work a lot of the time. So,
Mhm.
traditional genealogy involves really learning the names, the dates, the places our ancestors lived, the paths their lives took. And in order to do that, we use paper records as much as possible. We use oral histories to an extent, knowing that there may be some fabrications or some truth changes that take place as those oral histories get passed down, like a great game of telephone, right? So
Right.
in traditional genealogy, it's all about using records, census records, death certificates, newspapers, various rolls and logs and things like that, wills. When we add in the genetic component, in theory, it strengthens what we learned through the paper trail.
Mhm.
In practice, sometimes it takes us down the same path, sometimes it takes us down a different path because families are much more complicated than what a paper trail can tell us. But really, the two work together with the goal of uncovering more about who we are, where we came from, and more of those stories of our ancestors.
Well, there are two things here that are at work. So you're using a paper trail, and paper, I assume, can be census records, newspapers, stories that people have written down that you can go back and look at, and then you marry that with the genetic part of it. But 99%, 99.9%, I understand, of our DNA is exactly the same. So how in the world do you look at some strand of DNA or a chromosome and begin to differentiate one human being from another?
So, for genealogical purposes, it's really more about finding the similarities and those small differences. So, the more and more similar our genetics is to another person, the more likely it is they're closely related to us. So, for example, parent to child, about 50% of our DNA is the same because we
Hmm.
inherit from each parent.
Hmm.
Um, it's about looking chromosome by chromosome. There's certain sections of those chromosomes that really are used in genetic genealogy, and those comparatives and where things line up the same, those SNPs, those sections where they're the same and where they're different, help us determine how closely related we are to somebody. And when we get really into the science of it, it can help us see, is this a paternal match? Is this a maternal match? And even more, where is that branch coming from in our family history?
Right, I understand. So on these chromosomes, there are specific markers that you can look at so that even though 99.9% of human DNA is the same between all human beings, there's 7 billion people on the planet. And so 1/10 of 1% is a whole lot of variability when you're talking about a chromosome. And so people really need to understand that, because we say 99.9%, but that 1/10 of 1% can be a lot of variability. And that's how you
Absolutely.
begin, I understand, to see some of the differences. So in
Yeah.
that regard, one of the popular things that's happening that's going on is people wanting to know not only their family history and their ancestors, they want to know where on the planet they came from or how far back they go. Is
Yes.
that a challenge for you? What do they ask you?
So it's a challenge for a few reasons. Um, One reason is the DNA test most people take is called an autosomal DNA test. An autosomal DNA tests a wider variety of people in the sense of it's really about that every generation getting half the DNA, half the DNA, half the DNA from the
Sure.
parents and the parents, which means that by the time it gets to you from, say, a great grandparent or a great great grandparent, you only have a small portion of their DNA at that point.
Hmm.
So to go back very far in time using a traditional autosomal DNA test can be complicated because we're not following an unchanged path. When people do genetic testing to really learn about a specific one ancestor, some people use what's called mitochondrial DNA, and that
Hmm.
tests the mom's line. Males and females can take it because both of us receive mitochondrial DNA from our mothers. But it
Sure.
only tests the mom's line, just
Right.
one line, because that is basically an unchanged pass forward DNA strand, right? Well, not a
Hmm.
strand, but DNA. The other test that only men can take really comes from the Y chromosome, which also is pretty much unchanged, dad's dad. Now, in theory, that's great. A couple things can happen. When we want to talk about who we are and where we came from, when we think about the huge number of people we all come from, and we take a test like a mitochondrial DNA test or a genetic male person takes a Y-DNA test, we're really only testing one teeny tiny portion of who we are. And so
Hmm.
to say, I took this test, I know who I am, you don't really know who you are still. You know this one piece. And
Right.
it's still at the mercy of somebody saying, and this part is still not really a full science, that that specific piece of DNA that you're getting from your mitochondrial DNA from your mom's mom comes from this specific spot in this specific country.
Right.
And that's not super true. It's more people who live in that country now who have also been tested, who also have that same set of genetic markers. We're saying, therefore, you originate from the same place as they do.
Right. Understand. But that's why it's important to have both the paper part of it, the oral history part of it, and the more data you have, more information you have, the more sure you can be about the conclusions you draw.
Absolutely.
So I think we were discussing earlier, in my case, my grandmother was the biggest storyteller in the world. I mean, in a positive way, not the prevarication way.
Mhm.
But and she was clear that her grandmother came from Guinea, and she went even so far as to describe her height. that she was this little, she always said, she's this little guinea woman. And 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 describe her features and how she looked. And so one of my daughters did a DNA test, and sure enough, there was some markers that showed that her ancestors came from some region in Guinea. So that was just some verification, even though I'd already told my daughter, look, that's she she wanted to take the DNA test as well. And it was fun for her. I mean, I guess a lot of this is just fun for people as well.
It
Um,
really is. It really is. And there's some people who they take their DNA test, they get their results, and they never look at it again. It's kind of
yeah.
like they had that Christmas moment, for example, and they opened it, they read it, and they said, great, never need to look at it again. And
Or
yeah,
like I was telling you earlier, there's my youngest son who's like, hey, we all came from the same primordial soup. Who the heck cares?
exactly.
So
Exactly.
I guess it runs the gamut. But then I was saying that it was fun, but it's also, I don't want to call it the dark side, but the difficult side is when people find out things that were unexpected. So maybe I'll just call it the unexpected side or
Hmm.
the surprise side that happens. And how do you deal with that? I mean, that must be a challenge. You're doing this work and you hand somebody information. Do they want to shoot the messenger sometimes?
I make sure to put all the padding around me before I give them the information. So I make sure that anytime somebody takes a DNA test, whether they take it while working with me as a client, they take it beforehand and then have me analyze the results. We have a bit of a sit down and I make it very clear we don't know what we're going to find. Are you prepared for whatever version of your family we find? Are you prepared if we learn that a truth you believe about your family of origin may not be accurate? Maybe you have new family members you didn't know existed. Maybe somebody was not genetically related to your family, although they raised somebody in your family. So we have long talks before we start because as soon as you take that DNA test, although the ethnicity shifts slightly, those relationships are real. Those are
Mhm.
those are I would say quite accurate. People say, oh, maybe the DNA test is wrong. Maybe that person who's showing up as my grandfather, who I've never heard of, isn't really my grandfather. Well,
Mhm.
let's make sure really they're a grandfather and not maybe an uncle or something, right? But in terms of them actually being related to you, yes, if they're showing up on your DNA test results, they are related to you.
Right, absolutely. Well, I have to say that a lot of focus in genealogy lately has come from different ethnic communities, particularly the African American community that's been very interested in understanding their African heritage, wanting to know where specifically on the map they might have originated. And I guess that can be a challenge too. Are there particular challenges associated, well, not just with African Americans, but with any race, but particularly African Americans?
There really are, especially when your goal is again to know a specific place you're from. So if your family has only been, for example, in the United States for one or two generations, a paper trail and a DNA trail will probably be pretty accurate in getting you back to where your family was from in another country. If your family, like for most African Americans, has been in this family for generation upon generation upon generation upon generation, to follow a paper trail or a genetic trail to get you back to a specific place in Africa becomes quite difficult
Mhm.
because the paper trails have either been suppressed, never existed, or are just a bit harder to find. They absolutely can exist. There are people who have been able to trace, right? We have Alex Haley, who opened up so many things for so many people.
Right,
Um,
right.
but it is a more complicated process. Even when you add in the genetic component, I have a friend, he identifies as African American for every intents and purpose. He is an African American male. He took both a mitochondrial DNA test and a Y-DNA test, and both lines went back to Europe. And
Mm-hmm.
so, again, those are just two pieces of his DNA, but those are the easiest two to get back even further. But both of
Right.
them took him to European people. And think about the history of enslavement in this country. And there's so many stories about somebody who maybe the biological father was either an enslaver or was an overseer, or these types of narratives that absolutely have truth behind them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if that's your lineage, that's going to eventually take you to a white line, not a black line. But that doesn't mean that all of those people of African descent who fall into that same lineage don't still exist in your DNA. It's just harder to point them back out. So if I look at my DNA, for example, it has, 2% Congo or 7% Nigeria, or why actually that's like 45%, but right, all these different percentages. And
Right.
even with just getting that percentage, we have to think about migration patterns. So whether you're looking at African American DNA or even European DNA or whatever part of the world you're talking about, people didn't just live in one place. So, um, so even when you get that test and it says you're this percent whatever, that doesn't always account for the migration patterns of those people, which again, if you go back far enough, we all started in the same place in Africa and spread out around the entire world, right? So when we talk about going back and finding out where we're from, what is the point we're talking about? Like, what is the
Mm-hmm.
timeline
Yes.
place that we're talking about, the where we're
Right.
from? And I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that's talked about very often, because I like to say my dad's family is from Missouri. Like, no, but where are they really from? No, they're from Missouri. We're talking 5, 6, 7 generations in Missouri. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
at some point they moved to Missouri from somewhere else. But in terms of where they lived the longest as one, every single person, you can go through the whole fan of people, they're all in Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
So at what point do you say, okay, but if I trace back to Africa, um, where are my people from there? Well, now I'm looking at even more people and hoping somebody had some paper record. Or even if I see, again, I'm 40% Nigerian, who was that? How many people am I talking about that represents? Because that's not just one person if it's 45%. Now we're talking about a number of people who make up who I am today. But to be able to, for me, it's not necessarily about identifying a place, it's identifying people,
Mm-hmm.
because knowing a place doesn't tell me who those people were and what their lives were and what their stories were.
Right. So you mentioned the word identify quite a few times. And so there are different levels of identification. So it's identifying the place, identifying the time, identifying the history. And then I think there's the more complicated self-identification. My children have a white side of the family. They have a black side of the family. Some of them identify more with the white side of the family than they do the black side of the family. What does genealogy tell us about the human quest for identifying who they are and their sense of identity? I guess we're saying when you take in all of this information and all this variability, I guess it's personal. At some point, a person just chooses. Is that
Really,
right?
that's what it is. Um, identity is so strongly tied to culture,
Mm-hmm.
more so than anything else, right? So we take these DNA tests, whatever you look like physically, your results might not match what you look like physically or how
Mm-hmm.
others perceive you. So I think there's a big piece of identity that's about self perception and
Mm-hmm.
how you want to put yourself out in the world, right? So I'm biracial. I have a white parent, I have a black parent. I identify myself as biracial because culturally, the way I was raised was very blended. It was very much of both of my cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents instilled in me from a time I was little, you are the best of both worlds. You are a bridge, right? All of this language that really said you are all of these things. There are other people for whom they, like you said, identify more with one side than the other in terms of how they speak. That doesn't always mean that's how they identify self, right? So there's
Right.
multiple layers. They might be very firm in knowing, no, I am of these 2 races or these 4 races or whatever they are. But because it's confusing to everybody, I'm just going to say I'm Black or whatever,
Right.
right? Nobody can get it.
Right.
So I'm just Black to everybody else, even though I know that I'm whatever I am. When you add genetics into this, it can get
Mm-hmm.
super complicated, especially in the United States, because we have been, as we like to call ourselves, this melting pot, this stew, all of
Right.
these terms that we use.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there's all these people who identify as one thing, especially for African Americans, right? There's very few people who are African American who take a DNA test and it only has African in it.
Right.
Very rare, very
Right.
rare. I have English on my mom's side and on my dad's side in my genetics, for
Right.
example. Um, or there's people who believe they're fully white
Mm-hmm.
and they get their DNA test results back, and all of a sudden they have a small percent of some Congolese or something.
Mm-hmm.
Or on my genetics, on my white mom's side, we have Indian, we
Mm-hmm.
have all these things. It's like, well, where did that come from, right? How is
Mm-hmm.
that? And it's from our check line. So why does the check line
Right.
have India? Like, oh, it just changes everything, you know?
Right.
So at
Right.
what point, I think for me, identity has to be tied to culture, especially when we
Mm-hmm.
talk about people who find out they're 1% native or 2% native. And it gets really messy when we get to that. If that's not
Mm-hmm.
a culture that has been part of how you've been raised, you don't understand the traditions, you haven't been brought in with the languages, all
Oh,
of these different pieces, to all
good
of a
point.
sudden claim that as part of who you
Right.
are. I think to mention it, to say, yep, that's in my DNA, is very different than saying that's now who I am.
Right. That's interesting because I've spent a lot of time on native reservations and in native cultures, and I have to say that there are times and instances, depending upon on the people and the cultures that I'm interacting with, there's a little bit of resentment from native cultures when somebody comes in and says, well, I now consider myself a native person, and they look at you and why? Well, I did a DNA test and, I'm 2%, you know, Choctaw or Ojibwe. And, and,
Mm-hmm.
and there is resentment there. And I think it's because of what you're saying. And I don't think it's a callous kind of resentment, but how can you possibly say that when you're not part of this culture and you don't understand the traditions and you haven't grown up in this to make that kind of claim, which of
Mm-hmm.
course brings us to this broader issue as human beings when you consider that we're, as you said earlier, we all started out at this one point in Africa, and then this huge diaspora took place. And not
Mm-hmm.
only did that happen, then there was I'm going to say this wrong and I'll admit it up front, but there was a diaspora of people coming back to the areas that they originated from. So there was just through migration, there was just a lot of circulation of human beings throughout the earth. But I'm glad you brought up the cultural part of it too, because that really does have to be taken into consideration. Um, Switching reels a little bit, what have been some of the more exciting or interesting things that you've uncovered or that happened with the family that was just either exciting or a big aha moment for them, or maybe it changed their lives in some way?
So I had a family who, in genealogy, we call things brick walls when they're like a stuck spot. It's like we just
Mm-hmm.
can't get through it. So it's called a brick wall. So I've
Mm-hmm.
had a client who had a brick wall at their great grandfather. Couldn't get past him. He didn't really trust the government. He was a vet and had been a Pullman porter, so he'd seen a lot of things around the country
Mm-hmm.
and the world. And so he gave misinformation on almost every single document possible. Different birth years, different birth states, all kinds of nonsense, right? Um, I was able to use all of the misinformation as puzzle pieces, plus a couple random things. I finally just asked the family, did you ever go to a family reunion? And they
Mm-hmm.
said, yeah. I said, where was it? And they told me it was in somewhere in Arkansas, Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And just that opened everything up. I was able to
Mm-hmm.
find him as a child because that was on some of the random records. Arkansas was referenced, but I didn't know it to be any more true than when he said Oklahoma or North
Right.
Carolina or all these other random places.
Right.
And it turned out his parents were from North Carolina. So he did have a tie. So you started to see all of these random half truths started to
Uh-huh.
tell an actual story. Once I was able to get past him, I found his mother on a Freedmen's Bureau document.
Mm-hmm.
By finding his mother on a Freedmen's Bureau document, it listed her as a child, all of her siblings, her parents, her grandparents, the place her family had been enslaved, the name of the enslaver. It listed which of her siblings, aunts, uncles had passed. It literally took me back another 3 generations in this family
Mm-hmm.
to such a precious document like a Freedmen's Bureau document. And with that, we were able to research the family. And because of that, taking it back to DNA, all of these DNA matches they'd had all along that meant nothing to me, I was able to now put this family genetically back together even further and wider out because of this random question about a family reunion, this Freedmen's
Mm-hmm.
Bureau document, and just these groups of DNA matches. And I was then able to use genetic genealogy to confirm that I was on the right family line, that this Freedmen's
Right.
Bureau document was accurate because I was finding the families and the genetics that matched back up to it.
That's just amazing. That is a wonderful story. But I guess it's going to get even more interesting in with regard because we're really talking about data. And most people understand now with AI, it's made possible through machine learning that uses trillions of terabytes. That means trillions upon trillions of bits of information uh, in the learning process. So have you used or is AI now being applied to genealogical research?
Oh yeah. Um, I use it every day in
Hmm.
some way, shape, or form. I use it every single day. It is definitely becoming more and more frequently used in genealogy. So part of the ways we're using it are to read these super long documents, right? So
Hmm.
you'll get this boilerplate text about a will or something like that. When it's typed, it can read it. AI is starting to learn to read some of these older handwriting styles,
Oh,
which is,
really?
yes, it's working on it, which is
Whoa,
amazing. As you say,
it
whoa,
is.
right? It's amazing for so many reasons. First of all, it's very difficult to read some of the handwriting,
Hmm.
very difficult. And as we have more and more children not learning cursive, which will be a hill I die on, my children learned cursive. They can read it,
Right,
they can write it. Our history is in cursive.
right.
So it's a pro and a con that AI is learning it, right? Now the incentive to learn cursive may go down. But the fact that these documents will be able to be read, this is 5, 6 page documents where we can just have it take it, it can aggregate the data, it can pull out all that boilerplate text and really say, okay, I read this will. Person one got this, person two got this, person three, like it can aggregate that data in a
Hmm.
way that will save us hours and hours of time. AI
Right.
is already used without being called AI in
Hmm.
newspaper research. We use what's called
Right.
OCR. And
Oh, yes.
OCR is still just software
Right.
that
It's that
reads.
optical character recognition. Hmm.
Exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. So we don't call it AI, but it is.
It is. Yes, absolutely.
And we use that plus a search engine, right? To try and read
Hmm.
all of these older newspapers.
Hmm.
So yeah, I use it
That's
every day
amazing.
in some capacity. Yeah, I'm waiting for that handwriting to just really take off because that is going to change everything.
It certainly will. Well, you mentioned children, and I just have to ask you personally, do your children care about any of this?
Yes. So my daughter, she's in high school, and
Mhm.
I just let her take a DNA test, which I waited for a long time. She wanted to take it when she was younger. I said no. I wanted her to have a little bit more wherewithal and understanding of what she was doing. I know people who test their 3 and 4 year olds. I personally don't support that because I feel like they need to have more agency in that decision because it is a big deal to put that data out in the world.
Yeah.
Um, she's really excited. We talk a lot about family stories though. We talk about where people are from. I've taken her back to Michigan, where my mom's family is from. A lot of them are still on centennial farms, which means those
Mhm.
farms have basically been homesteaded by a member of my extended family and passed down generation to generation, and they still are in our family. She's gotten to be on that land, walk that land, be in those barns that my family built, my grandparents' parents built, the home my grandpa was raised in. And we've talked about, what does that feel like to her? What does that mean to be in those spaces? And she's been able to just feel that. And there's something about that feeling of being on your land that
Mhm.
is indescribable. But
Right.
yeah,
It's
she.
marrying,
Mhm.
yeah, marrying you to a sense of place.
Yes.
Right. So it's not
Mhm.
just a sense of identity in terms of who you are physically, but it can also anchor you in terms of a place, uh,
Absolutely.
which ends up being important as well. Wow, that's
Mhm.
just amazing. So you mentioned um, putting that genetic information out there in the world. It's a good segue to briefly talk about the forensic side of this and the criminal
Mhm.
justice system, which we're actually going to have a podcast on here in probably a month or so. We have Dr. Ehrlich, Henry Ehrlich, who you're probably familiar with, coming on. He developed, along with his colleagues, the PCR technology that's actually used in genetic studies and in forensics. So one of the things that happens when people put their information out there is that a detective in a police department will try to tie DNA from a crime scene to DNA from someone's genealogical study to see if they can find out who their relatives were to this potential criminal
Yeah.
who left DNA evidence at a crime scene. Have you had experience with that, or anyone said anything to you about that happening to them?
I haven't personally, but I've studied it a lot. I've read a
Mhm.
lot about it. I know people who have used it professionally from the other side of military repatriation as well.
Mhm.
They use it
Mhm.
to identify the bodies of fallen soldiers,
Right,
to return their remains to their family for proper burial and identification. Um,
right.
from the criminal side, it's so new but not new.
Mhm.
So what I mean by that is DNA has been used for a long time uh, in criminal forensics. This isn't a new
Mhm.
concept at all. We talked about it for years. It's on all the TV shows, right? But
Sure.
that used to be more of a DNA match, like a one-to-one. I tested this person, I have this blood or whatever, they're the same human. The
Hmm.
way it's being used now, as you mentioned, is more the same way we do our own personal genealogy, which is
Exactly.
put this match in the database, we'll figure out who they match with, and then we'll build out a family tree, figuring out who all the cousins and aunts and uncles and parents are, and see if we can pinpoint the exact person that is either the criminal or the victim in said crime.
Mhm.
The issues come with when we're that far removed, we don't necessarily know. We're not going to be at the same 100% this is the same person unless they're alive and can also DNA test on their own behalf.
Sure.
Some people feel that they don't want their genetics being used to implicate their own family,
Right.
especially when they did not consent. And be what it is, that is being done without consent on some of these sites in ways that I don't think we fully understand. We just don't
Right.
know. In theory, it's being done appropriately, but there's been enough study on it that show that it isn't always. So
Right.
other people say, well, it's not me. I didn't do anything wrong. If it's going to help
Hmm.
get somebody bad, quote unquote, off the streets,
Right.
let's do it. If somebody in my family made a quote unquote bad choice, lock them up. So I think the part that frustrates people is the lack of agency in that choice.
Right. No, and I definitely understand that. And And that lack of agency is a good segue to talk about something else. And you said two things. It's a segue to talk about something else that's extremely important, and that was the repatriation of military remains. And I didn't know this until I watched 60 Minutes the other day, which I never watch. I don't know why I watched this episode. Um, but I got sucked in it. It was really an important episode, and it's at the World Trade Center, where for the last, what is it now, 30 years?
It's been a while.
Um,
Yeah.
that they have actually been gradually recovering remains and doing DNA forensics work, identifying remains, and they've identified a certain percentage of the remains. And again, it's very interesting. Some people absolutely do not want to know and don't want any information. And they say, don't tell me anything. I don't want the remains. And other people are very interested and focused on understanding what happened to their loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
But this is another way that this technology is being used, and it's genealogical studies as well, and anthropological,
Absolutely.
and archaeological, because they're digging at a site that's been ruined for 30 some years. You were still recovering dust and things, and it's amazing the remains that they have recovered. I wasn't sure if you were aware of that kind of work that was going on, but
I
it's
didn't know
amazing.
about at the World Trade Center site. I know people are also using it for cold cases in
Hmm.
a similar way. There's an organization called DNA Doe.
Right,
I think that's what it's called. And it's all volunteers
right,
who sign on to help identify these unidentified victims often of things.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the other thing I want to talk about, because in I think a couple of weeks, I have a young lady who does a podcast. It's called DNA Today, and her whole focus is on counseling people with genetic diseases, particularly uh, infants or even human embryos that have genetic diseases, and she'll counsel the parents as to what they should do. These are tough decisions that people have to make. But in the work that you do, it's possible that you could uncover a lineage or a history of genetic diseases within a family that
Mm-hmm.
someone didn't know about, that would be critical information for them to have.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting you bring that up because I'm a cancer survivor. I have the BRCA1 gene, BRCA1. My
Mm-hmm.
father passed from prostate cancer, but actually it was a manifestation of that same gene. I've
Right.
had multiple siblings. We are part of that genetic testing from a medical standpoint. And I have been working because I know it's through my dad's mom. And the way I know that is because I do family history research. And I know that not only my dad's children, but my dad's brother, who's his half brother and only shares a mom, the cancer gene has been very unfortunately strong in their family as well. So I know I have to follow my dad's mom, my grandma's line to trace this cancer genetics back. Um, so in my case, I came at it backwards, which is I had the knowledge, but now I'm trying to trace the line and I'm learning so much. So for example, my grandma died very young. Nobody knew
Mm-hmm.
why. Her death certificate says heart, but she was a rural woman in Missouri. She wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think she probably had full medical care. Um, but when you start to see those patterns, in my case, I knew a little bit, but even if you don't, you start to see, wait, a lot of people are dying really young. Wait, I'm seeing death certificate after death certificate with a very similar cause of death that is either too early or it's just very curious, this pattern. Um, I always make sure to share that with my clients. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't suggest anything about genetic testing. I do let them know it's a thing that exists,
Mm-hmm.
that there are genetic counselors. And
Mm-hmm.
most times people go and talk to them, at least to start a conversation. So in those
Mm-hmm.
cases, in addition to making the more genealogical family tree for them, I'll make a genealogram.
Right.
So it's in the language that genetic counselors understand. And
Right.
I'll make that genealogram to really show the depth of whatever the condition or early death or whatever the cause of death was. just to see if it matters and does anything for a testing that that client or their descendants or parents could take.
Yeah. Wow. Well, you're doing some incredible work, and
Thank you.
it's extremely important. And I think you probably helped a tremendous amount of people. I mean, just with this little tidbit that we talked about right now, I mean, that could be a whole career, just helping people find out, information about heritability of different genetic diseases. It's just tremendous. Well, maybe we can wrap this up with a final question about, how do you think your work in genealogy, in the genealogy community, um, has influenced your perspective on the history of America as a whole, and not just America, but as the world? I mean, there should be some broader message that's out there, maybe for you personally, or that sometimes you communicate to people as you're talking to them.
I think the first thing for me is by studying genealogy, I've learned so much more about history, and you can't separate the two because our ancestors didn't live in a vacuum. They lived in circumstances the same way who we are and how we live is shaped by what's going on politically, economically, environmentally around us. And the more I've learned, the more my dad used to always say only the names change. He was a social worker, and for years and years and years, everybody thought their problem was so unique, right? And he's like, nope, only the names change. There's set
Right,
things, right? And obviously, he was
right,
being a bit facetious, but
sure.
I think it's similar, right? The human condition is the human condition. The ways we respond to traumas, the ways we respond to our environment, the ways we respond to changes politically, they have precedent in history all
Hmm.
over the world. And the
Right.
more we know about our family and just genealogy and history in general, I think it changes how we view our own lives and the world around us and our own current circumstances.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned earlier, and I don't know if I mentioned it on the show, President Bill Clinton said something at a meeting I was at recently that at least stuck with me and is kind of my personal mantra as far as all of this is concerned. And it's a very simple statement. It is important as our differences are, at the end of the day, our common humanity matters more. And hopefully that would bind us together. And I think our genetic history and our genealogy teaches us a lot about our common humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Mica, for joining us and sharing your journey. This has just been a tremendous conversation and uplifting at the same time. And of course, there's the fun component of it as well. And I love your smile. I hope people are
Oh,
getting
thank you.
that to see your smile, which
Thank
means that you
you.
must really love what you're doing. And
I
I hope
love it. I love it.
and I
Mhm.
hope you continue it. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of A Journey Through Nature and Science. If you are now inspired to research your own ancestry, you can go to Mica's website at andersgenealogicalservices.com. That's andersgenealogicalservices.com. Or access more information at our website at natureandsciencepodcast.com. Please leave a comment and hit that like button to help us grow the podcast. The more listeners, the greater the science literacy. Dr. Dan Airley will join us on our next episode. Dan is a 3-time New York Times best-selling author and professor of psychology and behavioral economics. Behavioral economics is a field that explains why we all behave the ways that we do in the world using principles from economics and psychology. He also produces the hit TV series Irrational. As always, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.